This is the story of Count Peter of Provence and the beautiful Magelone. Once upon a time there ruled in Provence a count who had an exceedingly handsome and splendid son. This son, whose name was Peter, grew up to be his parents' pride and joy. He was tall and strong. He was also practiced in the use of weapons. No one in his country or elsewhere could wield a lance or the sword as well as he, and he was admired by young and old, high and low, noble and commoner alike. One day his father gave a tournament to which many knights were invited. It was wonderful to behold the ease with which the tender youth unseated the most experienced warriors. He was hailed by one and all and honored as the best and strongest in the land. Among those gathered at the tournament was a singer who had visited many foreign lands. That evening he waited on Peter, saying, "Knight, let me give you some advice. If you would seek honor and fame, you should travel beyond your homeland and see something of the world and its people." So saying, the stranger took his lute, and this is what he sang.
Keinen hat es noch gereut, der das Ross bestiegen, in frischer Jugendzeit durch die Welt zu fliegen.
Peter listened quietly to the stranger's song. When it was finished, he remained withdrawn for a while, but at last he spoke. "Your song has revealed to me what it is I long for. I must see the world beyond these forests, these meadows." Then he went straight to his mother's apartments, where he also encountered his father, the Count. Falling humbly on one knee, he beseeched his parents to allow him to travel in search of adventure. The old Count was alarmed, and even more so his mother. But Peter insisted, "Beloved parents, I beg you, do not deny me this wish. It is my only desire to travel the wide world." Then he took up his lute, which he played very beautifully, and sang the song he had just learned from the visiting harpist. When it came to an end, his eyes were shining with tears. Then his parents, and especially his mother, were much moved. They arose and gave him their blessing. Soon commands went out to make every preparation for his journey, but meanwhile his mother took him to one side. Opening a casket, she took out 3 rings and said, "My son, I have treasured these 3 precious rings since I was a girl. Take them and honor them, and if you find a maiden whom you love and who loves you in return, you may give them to her." Peter kissed his mother's hand gratefully, and when morning dawned, he departed. He was in good spirits and eagerly spurred on his fine steed, which responded with a cheerful gallop. As he rode, an old song came into his head, and he sang it at the top of his voice.
Bogen und Pfeil sind gut für den Feind, hilflos alleweil der Elende weint, hilflos alleweil der Elende weint.
After traveling for many days, Peter arrived in Naples. On his way he had heard much about the king of that lordly city, and about his daughter, the Princess Magelone, who was said to be exceedingly beautiful, so that Peter was most eager to meet her face to face. Putting up at an inn, he learned from the landlord that a splendid tournament was to take place the following day in honor of a famous knight, Sir Henry of Carpone. It was open to strangers, so the next morning he donned his armor and betook himself to the lists. To the amazement of all, Peter soon emptied all other saddles until he had no further opponents. Naturally, he drew the attention of the beautiful Magelone, who secretly longed to see the unknown knight again. To her delight, a second tournament was announced, and when Peter once more entered the lists, she blushed and gazed steadfastly at him. Again he emerged victorious, and this time the king invited him to his table. Seated opposite the princess, Peter marvelled at her beauty, for he saw her close to for the first time. When the time came to take his leave, she took his hand and invited him to return often. In a daze he wandered through the streets, the name of Magelone ringing 1,000 times in his thoughts. Peter vowed that he would win Magelone's love or perish. It was late at night when he finally came home, to be overcome by a sweet slumber, in which dreams of love and elopement, solitary woods and stormy seas, danced on the walls of his chamber like a colourful tapestry. Meanwhile, Magelone herself was just as disturbed as her knight. She confided her love to her faithful nurse Gertrude, who was deeply troubled. "Dear child, why did you choose to cast your affection upon an unknown man, of whom no one knows where he comes from? Imagine the king your father when he learns of your love. Then you must seek him out, nurse. Find the unknown knight and inquire of him his name and rank, so that I may know whether I must live or die." So the next morning the nurse went to church and prayed. And there she saw the unknown knight, who was also kneeling and praying devoutly. When he saw her, he came over and greeted her politely, for he recognized her from the palace. When he heard the princess's message, Peter was overjoyed, and his heart beat fiercely, for he understood that Magelone loved him. "I beg leave to conceal my name a little longer, but you may assure the princess of my high nobility. In the meantime, give her this keepsake from me." And he gave the nurse one of the 3 precious rings, together with a parchment on which he had written of his love for her. As soon as Magelone saw the ring, she knew that the knight must come from a noble house. As for the song he had written, she read it and re-read it.
Liebe kam aus fernen Landen, und kein Wesen
Magelone was deeply moved by Peter's song. It echoed her own feelings exactly. But her nurse was much aggrieved. "My child, he is still a stranger." "A stranger?" cried Magelone. "Oh, dear Gertrude, what care I for the whole wide world if he should remain a stranger to me?" Then she took to her bed, overcome by emotion. So the nurse again sought Peter out, and once more found him in church. She told him how pleased the princess was with the ring and the song, and how she had dreamt of him in the night. Peter blushed with joy and said, "Give her this second ring, and ask her to wear it as a remembrance of me." The nurse hastened back to Magelone, who, when she saw the ring, jumped out of bed, crying, "I dreamt of this very ring! This means the rest of my dream must also come true." Then she read the sheet of parchment that had concealed the ring.
"So willst du des Armen dich gnädig erbarmen, so ist es kein Traum. Wie rieseln die Quellen, wie tönen die Wellen, wie rauschet, wie rausch."
The following morning, Peter went to church a 3rd time, hoping for another message from his heart's desire. And once again the nurse came to him, and this time she said, "Sir Knight, if you assure me that you will love my lady with due modesty and virtue, I shall tell you where you may meet her." Peter dropped to his knees and raised his hand. "I swear," he said, "that my purest thoughts shall always be with Magelone. I love her with all modesty and virtue. Amen." The nurse was satisfied, and told him to come to a secret door in the garden wall next afternoon. "You may speak with her in the garden. I shall leave the 2 of you alone, so that you may be undisturbed and can reveal what is in your hearts." She told him the hour at which to come, and then left. Peter watched in intoxicated amazement as the nurse departed. All of a sudden, he was alarmed at the thought of speaking to Magelone. Yet it was his dearest desire, and he could not calm himself. So he took up his lute again and sang.
Wie soll ich die Freude, die Wonne denn tragen, das unter dem Schlag...
At last it was the hour at which the two were to meet. As instructed, Peter went secretly through the garden, where he found the princess waiting for him. The nurse left, and without speaking, Peter fell upon one knee. Magelone extended her lovely hand to him, bade him rise and sit by her side. For a long time their conversation faltered. Every attempt at speech was interrupted by the tender glances that they exchanged one with the other. But eventually the young man found his voice. He declared that ever since he first beheld Magelone, he had been entirely hers, and that his whole life was dedicated to her. Then he gave her the third ring, the most precious of all. At this, Magelone was deeply moved. She rose and held out a fine golden chain, which she placed around his neck, and said, "I now acknowledge that you are mine and I am yours. Take this token and wear it always, if you love me." Then she took the astonished knight in her arms and kissed him warmly on the lips. With joy, Peter returned her kisses, pressing her warmly to his heart. And when the time came to part, he hurried back to his room, happier than he had ever been in his young life.
War es dir, dem diese Lippen beten, dir der dargebotene süße Kuss, gibt ein irdisch Leben so Genuss.
Now it so happened that the King of Naples wished to marry his daughter to that same knight, Sir Henry of Carpone. Then Magelone, who had continued to receive Peter in secret, said to him, "My father wishes to marry me to Sir Henry of Carpone. If you truly love me, you must fly from here and take me with you. Don't be afraid. I trust you with my life. Meet me tomorrow night at the secret door in the garden wall with 2 strong horses, and I shall be yours forever." Peter was happy and amazed to hear these words. "Yes," he said, "we shall ride to my father's castle, and there the most holy bond shall unite us forever." He left immediately to make the necessary preparations for his journey with all speed and secrecy. Returning to his room, Peter was moved to see his beloved lute lying on the little table. It had been the confidant of all his sweetest secrets. Now he took it up for the last time and sang. As soon as night fell, Magelone slipped out through the garden, carrying with her just a few personal treasures. At the gate stood Peter with the horses. He lifted her into the saddle, and in a moment they were galloping away into the darkness. Peter had planned carefully, choosing to ride towards the forest that lay close to the sea, where the paths were the most secluded and where there was the least danger of meeting other travellers. On they rode until midday, when Magelone began to feel a great weariness, whereupon they both dismounted in a lovely cool spot deep in the forest. Peter spread out his cloak, and Magelone lay down upon it, with her head resting in the knight's lap. He smiled to himself as he saw her beautiful eyes close, their long black lashes casting delicate shadows on her sweet face. Quietly, so as not to awaken her, he sang to himself.
Ruhe, süß Liebchen, im Schatten der Grün.
Gazing up into the treetops, Peter saw that a flock of birds had gathered in the branches. As he was watching them, it suddenly seemed to him as though Magelone in her sleep caught her breath with fright. So he loosened her gown, and her lovely white bosom appeared from beneath the garments that covered it. Entranced by its beauty, Peter felt his senses reeling. Just then, he noticed a red silken pouch that had been hidden between her breasts. Curious, he unfolded it and found the 3 precious rings that he had given her. Much moved to discover how lovingly and carefully she had protected them, he wrapped them up again and placed them on the grass by his side. Suddenly, a raven flew down from the tree above him, and before Peter could prevent it, had carried away the pouch. Peter jumped to his feet and began to pursue the raven as it flew ahead of him, but it flew on regardless until they came to the seashore. At last he found a small weather-beaten boat. Jumping in, he took hold of a broken branch and rowed with it as best he could towards the little pouch. But all of a sudden, a strong wind blew from the shore. The waves piled one upon another and began to buffet the little boat. Peter fought against them with all his might, but the waves carried him further and further out to sea. In agony he thought of his beloved Magelone, whom he had left asleep in the forest glade. Flinging himself down in the bottom of the boat, he raged at the foaming waves.
So tönet den schäumende Wellen und windet euch rund mich her und windet euch.
Meanwhile, back in the forest, Magelone awoke refreshed from a sweet sleep, thinking her beloved was still sitting by her side. When she did not find him there, she was frightened and began to walk up and down, calling his name in a loud voice. Receiving no answer, she began to weep and to sob. "Oh, faithless knight," she cried, "why have you abandoned your innocent lover? What have I done to you that you should steal me from my parents and then leave me to die in this wilderness?" But as she wandered mournfully through the wood, she soon came upon the 2 horses, still tethered as Peter had left them. "Oh, forgive me, my beloved. Now I see that you are innocent and have not left me deliberately. But what dreadful misfortune can have torn us apart?" So began Magelone's lonely pilgrimage. Taking just a few provisions, she began walking through the dense forest, until one day she found herself standing in a quiet, pleasant meadow, on the other side of which was a small hut. And when an old shepherd approached her, she begged him for shelter. The old shepherd and his wife received her kindly, and in return she willingly undertook all the tasks she could to help them. But she told them nothing of her history. When the old couple went out together, she would guard the house, sitting before the door with her spindle, and singing sadly of her lost happiness.
Wie schnell verschwindet so Licht als Glanz, der Morgen findet verwelkt den Kranz, der gestern glühte.
Far out at sea, the sun rose in its majesty over the wide expanse of ocean, waking Peter from the stupor into which he had fallen. Sailing towards him, he saw a great ship, manned by Moors and pagans, who took him on board. Delighted with their captive, they decided to take him as a gift to their sultan. The sultan was pleased with Peter, whom he set to wait on him at table, as well as putting him in charge of a fine garden. But he often walked sadly among the flowers in the garden, lamenting the loss of his beloved Magelone.
Muss es eine Trennung geben?
Now the Sultan had a daughter named Sulima, who was famed throughout the land for her beauty. She had many opportunities to observe the foreigner, and without her realizing it at first, a passionate love began to find its way into her heart. The knight's sadness appealed to her. She wished she could talk to him and comfort him, and so one day she had a slave bring him to her in a secluded part of the garden. Peter was surprised and embarrassed. Though he marveled at her beauty, in his heart he remained true to Magelone. Yet the desire to see his homeland again so overcame him that his heart weakened, and he began to reflect on a bold stratagem. The pagan maiden had told him she wished to flee with him, so, believing that Magelone must be dead, he agreed to run away with her, and in this way hoped to return to Christendom and to his parents. The Sultan's garden lay by the seashore, and on the night appointed, Peter lay down under the trees to await the pagan maid's arrival. But falling into a slumber, he had a dream in which Magelone appeared to him, as lovely as ever, but with a countenance full of reproach. Waking with a start, he was horrified at himself and his intent. "Oh, faithless and ungrateful that I am! How could I look Magelone in the face were she still alive? And why should she not be when I have so miraculously survived?" Bravely, he climbed into a small boat, and entrusting himself to fortune and the stars, he rowed manfully out to sea. As the land dropped away behind him, he heard the agreed signal, a zither playing in the garden, and the sound of a heartfelt and beautiful voice.
Zaubert dein irrender Fuß, die Nachtigall plaudert von Sehnsucht und Gruß.
As Peter heard this song, he was mortified at the thought of his infidelity and fickleness. He rowed faster and faster to get further from the shore, all the time propelled by one love while drawn back by the other. In his ears the waves accompanied the siren song as if it was written in their language too. But gradually the song from the shore grew fainter. Now it seemed only the quiet blowing of the wind, then the last trace of it died away, and only the waves still rippled. All was silence, save for the splashing of the oars. As the song died away, Peter's courage returned. He hoisted the sail, took the tiller, and sang.
Wie froh und frisch mein Sinn sich hebt, zurück bleibt alles.
When day dawned, Peter saw that the land was no more than a blue cloud on the horizon, and he was terrified at the vast expanse of sea and sky around him. He saw a small, uninhabited island. Peter disembarked and walked inland through a pleasant valley where he sat down in a field full of flowers. He began to daydream and fell asleep among the flowers. When the moon rose, some fishermen took a boat to the island, and there they found the youth, stretched out on the ground as though dead. Gently they placed him in their little boat and sailed away in the hope of restoring him to life. Peter regained consciousness and learned that they were taking him to an old shepherd and his wife. He rewarded the fishermen for their service and found himself approaching a small cottage across a beautiful green meadow, radiant in the morning light. There sat a young maiden in a simple dress, who greeted him in a friendly manner and invited him inside to rest. For 2 days she nursed him until he regained his former strength. He took her into his confidence and told her all his misfortunes. Then Magelone, for it was she, suddenly got up and went to her room, put on her former fine garments, and thus arrayed revealed herself to Peter's sight. In amazement and happiness he took her in his arms, and so were the lovers reunited. With great joy, Peter and Magelone returned to his parents' castle, where they were married amidst great rejoicing. In front of the palace, he and his young bride planted a lovely tree, and from then on they would join their 2 voices together and sing the song that they sang that day.